So I'd like to welcome everyone to this Tuesday talk and welcome our speaker, Amy Stone, who's the Engagement Officer for the Dialect and Heritage Project. So she'll be speaking to us about that project tonight and about the 3 Sussex villages which were surveyed as part of the Survey of English Dialects, East Harting, Sutton and Warnham. Before I hand over to Amy for what promises to be a really interesting talk, there's just a couple of administrative bits to cover. So first of all, when you join this session, you will have seen that it's being recorded. Don't worry, it's only the speaker and the presentation which will be recorded. Your videos are all off, so it's only me and Amy's presentation that will appear. And that recording will be available on our YouTube channel a bit later this week. Secondly, I'll be launching a short poll at the end of the talk. It takes less than a minute or so to fill out, and if you're able to do that, that'd be fantastic, as it helps us to shape and develop our remote talks program. Finally, if you have any questions, please just pop them in the chat box, which you can find if you hover over the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. It's the one that's shaped like a speech bubble. You can pop them in the chat box as the talk is going on or at the end of the talk. We'll pick them up once the talk is finished, and Amy has kindly offered to answer them. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Amy. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Jenny. I'll just get my presentation up for you all. Great. So as Jenny said, my name's Amy and I am the Engagement Officer for this region on the Dialect and Heritage Project. And I just wanted to start by kind of explaining it's quite a big project. It's a really exciting one. So I thought I'd start at the very beginning and let you know that it's a national collaboration between the University of Leeds and 5 rural living museums around the country. And our closest one is the Weald and Downland Museum in Sussex, where I have the pleasure of being based. And the project has been made possible by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and brings in a lot of the special collections held at the University of Leeds. So it is really a national project. As you can see from my title, Engagement Officer, I'm not a linguist. I'm very interested in this topic and the content I'm about to share with you, and I'd like to take you on a kind of voyage of discovery with me along the way. So when it comes to the questions at the end, I will do my best, but I just want to let you know that the project has many great linguists on it, but I am not one of them. We will have time for questions at the end. So if you have any thoughts or questions or even words that you'd like to share with us, please do pop them into the chat just there. As I said, starting right at the beginning, I just thought I'd give you a quick run through of what we're defining dialect as. So dialect for us is a form of speech or writing that particularly marks someone out as being part of a group, particularly in relation to their geographic location or particular social groups. It's comprised of 3 things. It's not just the words that we say or the accent, but it's also the grammar. So we have those 3 things coming together within this project, and hopefully you'll be able to hear a little bit more about how those things work together as we go along. We also have been thinking quite a lot through this project about identity and dialect, because many times you'll feel as though you're part of a community thanks to the way that you're speaking, but it also can be quite exclusive depending on where you are and if you've moved to a new area. And we know that changes over time as people move around the country and times change. So first of all, I wanted to get you thinking about your own dialect. So if you wouldn't mind just popping into the chat what your word is for these baked goods. So I'll give you just a couple of seconds and minutes to think about what you call these things. And then I will have a look and see what you're saying. So what do you call in your house these baked goods? You might have bacon in them, or you might have ham in them. What do you call these baked goods? Bap. We've got a bap from Jenny. Any others? I would call it maybe a bacon bap. Any other offerings for what you might call this? Is it a roll? Is it a cob? What do you call it? Any offerings? Okay, we'll move on to the next one. How about this one? What do we all call this sticky thing that grows in your garden that you might throw at people and it might stick to their jacket? Any ideas? Offerings for what you might call this? You may have never seen it before. Give you a couple of seconds. If no one's got anything, we'll move on to the next one. Last but not least, we have this creepy crawly. Does anyone have any names for this one? You call it a daddy long legs? Or maybe something else? Okay, on we move. So let's go to the next one. So the Survey of English Dialects was an extraordinary piece of work that is still used by linguists today as a sort of really good baseline for any future research. And it was based at the University of Leeds, and it started sort of post the Second World War. And the idea was that the SED, as we call it, Survey of English Dialects, would see researchers visit about 313 locations. Most of them were rural villages, although a few of them were bigger cities, particularly up north. And researchers would go to these villages and they would ask 1,300 or more questions to about 2 to 3 people. And they would complete part of this sort of pre-prepared questionnaire. Oh, we've just had a thanks, Sue, roll, sticky weed and daddy long legs. Lovely, thank you. And those types of questions were the ones that were asked in the 50s and 60s. And this information was then collated as about 400,000 items of information, which were then popped into the Leeds archive. We've got some, I'm going to go back, we've got some lovely things coming in on the chat just there. The chat was disabled. We're now back up and running. Thank you very much for letting us know. So we have lots of lovely responses. Sticky Willy, crane fly, yeah. Buns, that's another one that I've heard as well. Crane fly, bun, sticky balls, yeah. Cleavers, lots of great responses. Butty, yeah. Sticky buds. So as you can see, we've already got tons of variation there from a relatively small group of people. Goosegrass, tufts, yeah, great word. Daddy long legs, yeah, great. I'll let you keep going in the chat as I carry on. So as I said, these questions were very much the types that were asked by researchers from Leeds. And what they did is they had this pre-prepared questionnaire, as I said. And one of the main reasons that they did this was that there was this worry that things were going to disappear, words were going to disappear, and the way that we were going to talk was going to change. So, for example, as people moved around the country, would language be diluted? Would our dialect disappear? And you can see from this quote from Stanley Ellis, one of the main researchers, that it was kind of a last minute exercise to grab this information before everything changed. And what we now know is that things do change, language evolves every day, but gathering it and looking at it and celebrating it is a huge part of the ethos behind what we're doing. And as you can see, kind of 70 years later, on the right-hand side there, we have a map which shows the scope of the Dialect and Heritage Project today. So started in 2018 and then is continuing into next year. And it's a partnership between the 5 partner museums, which you can see on the screen there: Rydell Folk Museum, the Dales Countryside Museum, Avoncourt Museums of Historic Buildings, Museum of East Anglian Life, now the Food Museum, and also the Weald and Downland Museum in Singleton. And the idea is that we're able to look into these really exciting Leeds-based archives in the Special Collections, Brotherton Library, and combine those with museum collections like the one held at the Weald and Downland Museum, in order to go out back to these places that were visited, the 313, or as many as we can get to, villages that were visited, to see what's happened now, what's happened in the last 70 years, and do our own, albeit much smaller, version of the Survey of English Dialects, which began in the 1940s. So if I just move on. So to zoom a little bit closer, here is the map of the area covered by the Weald and Downland Museum for the benefits of this project. So there are 18 villages in this patch across East and West Sussex, Surrey, and in Hampshire. And as you can see, they're relatively spread out across the region, although there are some gaps. And one of the ways that they chose these villages was that they were isolated. So many of them don't have train stations, and they don't have reliable bus routes and things like that. And the idea was that these villages would enable the researchers to gain a window into the past in order to better understand the way people live their lives in these places, and also the words that they were using. Today, we're obviously talking about West Sussex, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit further, and we're going to talk about East, Harting, Warnham, and Sutton. But before I do that, I would just like to talk a little bit more about the really rich archive in Leeds. As I said, most of it belongs to the Survey of English Dialects, which took place from 1946 to 1978. But then they did a kind of extra bit of work in the form of the Institute of Dialect and Folk Life Studies between 1964 and 83. And the result of this is an amazingly rich archive, which comprises about 2,000 and growing photographs, 900 audio recordings, which include all of the responses to these 1,000 questions that I talked about before. There's also the amazing notebooks and the newspaper reports on the original survey, in addition to 200 or more studies on various different local trades, beliefs, customs, and other things like that. And it's an amazing resource. And I'll share the project website at the end. But one of the great things about getting this funding has enabled us to digitize many of the photos and audios. And as you can see on the screen, some of them are really, really lovely. When it comes to the Survey of English Dialects, we can't talk about it without talking about the people that took part in the survey. They were called informants at the time, and they were predominantly people who had grown up in these very rural communities, and they'd spent little or no time away from their home village. They were predominantly interested in men who were less inclined to change the way they spoke in order to please people. And they were also intelligent and had a good set of teeth. So they were old men with good teeth that could help with this research. And here are just a few of them from around the country, and you can see that they're quite often pictured doing whatever it is that they were talking about within their interview. So we've got Jimmy Marsden, Amos Brown, and Bill Hewison here. But we'll get back onto the Sussex ones in just a second. So on we go. One of the other things that's quite fun about this questionnaire was that while it was predominantly about rural trades, There was also quite a focus on what you call parts of the body and parts of the home. So one of the questions was, what do you call the brownish marks or spots that some people have in the skin on their faces, especially ginger-haired people? So I would call those freckles. And as you can see on the right here is an extract from the response book from Walton on the Hill in Surrey. And you can see right at the top, it says E Whitehead, and then a little bit further down it says 1, and then that is the phonetic spelling of freckles, the way that Mr. Whitehead responded to that question. But the responses to that question were hugely varied. So we have here a little map on the left. So this just covers the northern counties, and much of the research was up in the north, at least to start with. So you can see that we've got freckles, which, as I said, as someone who grew up in Sussex would call them freckles. But you also have burntacles, murfles, briny spreckles, freckles, and frontals, amongst other things. So this research enabled them to build these amazing maps, which then reflected the picture of the language landscape of the time in the 1950s and 60s. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to test your deciphering. So I'm going to put these up on the screen, and if you can tell me in the chat what you think these were all words for. Hedgehog, yes, lots of hedgehogs. Brilliant. You all got that one nice and quickly. Thank you very much. Little hoggies, that's a lovely name for them. I like that a lot, Alice. Great, okay, let's move on to the next one. What about this? This one's a bit different. What do you think these are all names for? Slush, slotch, slop, slob, sludder. Mud, says Linda. Close? Not quite. Think a bit colder. Yeah, melted snow or wet snow. Yeah, icy slush. Even there, we've got lots of lovely dialect words coming out. Yeah, melted snow. Lovely, thank you. How about this one? Twitten, lone, mere, gully, drift, loke. Alley, snicket, alleyway, yeah. Passageway, passage in town. Yeah, see, you're all too good at this. It's great. Lane, yeah, lovely. How about this one? Dodman, Hodmidod, Dodders, Dodney Hornies, Pac-Man. Any ideas? Oh, postman, not quite. This one's a bit tricky. Head, travelling, maybe. Think small insect. Not woodlice. Beetle. No, this one's really tricky. It's got a shell on its back. Snail, there we go. Dodman and Hodmidod are all different words for snail. Right, what about the next one? We've got chiggy pig, monkey pea, cheese log, roly-poly, slater. There we go, woodlice, woodlouse. Lovely. Who have you heard those words from? Who in your life calls it a roly-poly or a chiggy pig? Cheesy Bobs, yeah, in Surrey. Lovely. Slater from a Scottish friend. Thank you, Penny. Great. So many rich words to look at today. Trundleberry. That's one I've not heard before. Ah, okay, one more. What about this one? Tog, clobber, glad rags, sheaths, clothes, best clothes, yeah, lots of clothes, yeah, Sunday best, yeah, lots of people saying that. Have you heard any other words for your tog? Clouts, clobber, yeah. Posh clothes, yeah. Sunday best. Lots of words. Great. Thank you all very much for sharing those words with us. Best bib and tucker, yeah, lovely one. Fab. I'll let you all continue sharing in the chat as we move forward. So, as promised, we're going to get down to the West Sussex picture. So of those 313 locations in the country, we have these 3 that are in West Sussex. So we've got Sutton, Warnham and East Harting. And what I've done just here is given you the names of the interviewees that were chosen, the informants from these villages. So we had a Mr. Francis and a Miss Francis in Sutton, and they were brother and sister living together. And then we also had a Mr. Goodger. Warnham, we had Mr. Frank Cox and Mrs. Chanel. And in East Harting, we had Mr. Norgate and Mr. Pryor. And he's recorded in the survey as Harry Pryor and Henry Pryor. So we're not totally sure. Many people went by different names and still continue to do so. And as you can see, the old men with good teeth is true of Sussex. So most of them are men, although there are obviously a couple of women, and they were all born in this sort of very late 1870s and 1880s. And that means that when they were interviewed in 1959, which is when Michael Barry was in this area, they would have been anything between 79 and 80 something. So a real mix of people from these different areas that clearly fit within that remit of being mostly old men with good teeth. Oh, we was missing. Oh, we might have to talk about that later, Jenny. Thank you very much for sharing that. So we'll go through the villages one at a time, and I'm going to share some of the things that both the Leeds Archive of Vernacular Culture has, and also some of the things from the Weald and Downland Museum that supports that work. Let us first go to East Harting. So I've included a map just in case those of you who maybe aren't super local may not know, and also even if you are, these are tiny places, so you may have never visited. And one of the lovely things about the response books, as they were called, the researchers' notes from the survey, was that they produced these descriptions of the villages. And this provides us a real snapshot in time. When Michael Barry arrived in 1959, he was able to record what he saw. And one of the other things that's quite remarkable about this endeavour was that the researchers from Leeds arrived in the villages. They had no digs arranged, and they went and they were told to go and see someone influential. So they went into either the local shop, the post office, or went over to see the postman. And the idea was that they would know, A, somewhere they could stay, and B, the people it was worth talking to. So off Michael Barry went and visited East Harting, and this is what he said. So he said, this village is quite isolated, being situated around the meeting point of 3 lanes at the foot of the Downs. It is 2 miles from the Hampshire border, and the dialect appears to be strongly influenced by Hampshire forms, and most of the villagers have some connection with that county. There is no railway station, and the bus runs infrequently to a point about half a mile distant. The local school and church is in South Harting, 1.5 miles away. The village is quite separate from South and West Harting. There are several good dialect speakers, all living in the same row of cottages, apart from the newcomers. There has been little recent development. Farming is chiefly concerned with grain and sheep. Cattle are only a recent innovation. So as you can see, many of the themes we've talked about already really come across in Michael Barry's notes. There's no railway station. There's no real bus service. It's quite separate from the other Hartings, South and West Harting. And he's noted that there are several good dialect speakers and they all live together. in the same row of cottages. And we'll come back to that in just a second. But I just think having that snapshot in time from the 1950s in the summer when Michael Barry arrived, I think it's quite extraordinary. So let's go on from here to listen to a little bit of the audio. So I've got a few audios to play for you this evening, and I just wanted to let you know that I've subtitled this first one, but the rest of them are for you to listen to. And they were recorded in the 1950s, and we've got brilliant stories of the equipment being hooked up to TV aerials and things like that so that they could get a signal. So I've done what I can to boost the audio quality, but I hope that you can still get something out of it. So here we have Harry Pryor, as I said, Harry/Henry Pryor, and he was 78 at the time, and he talks in this one about carrying straw on his back in order to then thatch a stack of corn. So let me play this for you.
Used to put it in stacks, and so we used to do all that. And then after a time, we had them covered in thatch. Put a heap of straw down and shook it all up and watered it, and then brought out these bundles and took it up on a fork on your backs, and let it down in courses. That was all done. And we had a few spars, you see, to spar it down. That's what you splits down, you see, in points.
So there we are. We have Harry's lovely description of thatching corn stacks or ricks. And one of the great things about this project is we also then have a photograph. So these corn stacks aren't in Sussex, they are from elsewhere, but it really enables us to understand what Harry is saying a little bit more. So you can imagine him with the corn on his back, stacking up these ricks and building them in order to protect the hay or the corn from the elements as we went along. As I've mentioned, we have the response books, as we call them, the researchers' notepads, and they're all recorded in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So as you can see on the left-hand side here, we have Mr. Norgate's response book from East Harting, which was done on the 1st of July 1959 by Michael Barry. And this response book page refers to part 9 of book 2, which concerns farming and in particular haymaking. So you can see from question 10, which is just circled there, he was answering the question, when your scythe gets blunt as you are using it, what instruments do you use on it? So you can see in the circle just there that he's said rubber and emery stone. And I just want to add that as I said, I'm not a linguist. We've got some brilliant linguists on this project who are able to share this information, and much of it is on the website as well. As we go down, we've also got, when the grass has been mowed for haymaking, what do you do next? Turn it, says Mr. Norgate. How do you store the hay outside for use over winter? Ricks. So we heard Mr. Pryor talking about the ricks or haystacks, and we have the same here from Mr. Norgate. And then we go on to say, if hay is stacked too green, what do you say it does to the stack? So you can see in the circle just there, it catches fire or gets swept, was Mr. Norgate's response to that question. And these response books really clearly articulate the local dialect without necessarily having an audio recording. So as I said, some of them we do have audio recordings for, but the IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet, enables us to understand what was said and how it was said in response to these very particular questions. And the left column is where that information is. And then you have the right-hand column, which has these sort of additional bits of information, any additional comments that the informant might have made, and little drawings which refer to particular either tools or kind of concepts that came up during the course of the interview. Let's not skip too far. And those drawings are really quite fun. So we have a few just here of hay knives, as they were called by many. and they would have been used to cut down the hay from the rick or the haystack. And you can see just from these 4 drawings that there's quite a lot of regional variation in terms of the tool, potentially how it was used, how the handle worked, things like that. And then we also have, very luckily, the second in from the left, we have a drawing of the informants. So we have a real insight into their handwriting. We've got Mr. Brading there from Whitwell on the Isle of Wight, who quite clearly took the pen, took the paper, and wanted to share his drawing just there. And occasionally you see, as we do on the right here, a crossing out and a redraw. And I like to think about that as the informant saying, no, it doesn't look like that, it looks like this. And you can really see the interaction there between the researcher and the informant. And this continues on many, many different themes within the archive. And one of the great things about the partnership between the archive and the museums is we're able to take this paper-based, predominantly, and audio-based, I suppose, archive and look at the real objects within the context of the museum. So we have 3 here that kind of relate to haymaking, as Mr. Pryor and Mr. Norgate have described to us so far. So on the left, we have a staddle stone or a saddle stone or a steddle stone, depending on who you ask. And these were used, in this case, it's under a granary, but they were also used under haystacks in order to keep rats and mice away, because they were such a shape that the rats and things, you couldn't navigate them successfully. And then in the middle, we have a rick stand, which was used to put a rick on or haystack on. So you can see a number of mini steddle stones around, and then it's sporting a platform, which then served the purpose of keeping the hay from the ground. And then on the right, just there, you can see one of the types of hay knife that you saw in the drawing previously. So it's a really great way of building from a multitude of collections in order to better understand these communities. Let's go on. So one of the facets of our project today is we're not just looking back into the 1950s, we're also thinking about these communities now and people that have a connection to places like East Harting in the present day. So me and a lovely team of volunteers, as well as my colleagues in other regions, are going out back to these places and asking them, thankfully not 1,000 or more questions, but a number of questions in order to build a picture of the place today. And sometimes we're able to use the archive to support that work. So as you can see on the right, we have a photo that's described as East Harting, West Sussex, but we didn't know where it was. And what I did is, in an interview with a chap called Stuart, I showed him this picture and I just said, on the off chance, it might be worth asking, do you have what it was? He immediately said, yes, it's called Kent Lane. And then he started to tell me this story, which I've included an extract of just here. And basically, I won't read it to you, you can read it to yourself if you would like. But he did his paper round down this Kent Lane, just off what's called Turkey Island. And he came across, well, originally he said a big cat. So I thought he meant a domestic cat, a large domestic cat in the street. But it turns out that he came across a puma while on his paper round. And it was just this amazing moment of kind of serendipity, really. I'd found this local chap who was happy to speak to me. I'd shown him a photo, it was, he did, and he also had this cracking story to go with it. And that's one of the ways that we're kind of building on this layered approach to this research, because all of that will then go back to the archive. And his story, his tale will go alongside those of his predecessors. And it's also particularly nice because I since learned out that Stuart was sort of, he knew Mr. Norgate and Mr. Pryor. His grandparents lived in that same group of cottages that we mentioned before. So he sort of knew of them and he was able to share some stories about them too. So it's a really nice mixture within this project. We'll now move on to Warnham. So Again, in 1959, a little bit later in the year, November, Mr. Barry was in Warnham, and he says about this one that it's a large village about 2 miles north of Horsham. It's on the Surrey border is 4 miles north again. It is situated 1/4 of a mile off the Horsham-Dorking Road. Again, buses are irregular and the railway station is 2 miles away from the centre. A large estate has been built since the war and there are some Londoners living in it, but before that the villages must have changed little. Farming is mixed and most informants are equated with the notions of the questionnaire. Many villages are occupied with the local brickfields. The dialect is quite well preserved and in a number of speakers. So again, we have the same themes. Not a great bus route, not a close railway station. There is some talk of kind of newcomers or incomers to the area, but it's really, really reflective of the project's aims in the 1950s. So in Warnham, I'd like to introduce you to Frank Cox. So Frank Cox talks again in a similar way to Mr. Pryor and Mr. Norgate about corn and thatching haystacks. So as you can see from this quote that I've just got up here, he talks about the various different stages in that process. So he talks about machinery going in, fag hooks and rakes, putting them into sheaves, and then putting the sheaves into shocks, and then sanding them up to dry out a little bit before they were then thatched. And as I said before, this is a really great record of this process that is almost never done now. And it's preserved within the archives in the form of the transcriptions and also the audios. So I'd like to introduce you to Frank's voice. Here he's talking about something a little bit different. He's talking about making a headland in a field in order to plough it. And we'll hear a bit more from him later, but I'll just play this one for you.
In the field, if the horses go all around the field with the horses and make a headland first.
You are, him and his, talking about his headland there.
All around. And you start at one side and throw out a fur each side, and after you done that, you go up, the horses go up one side, down the other, and gather it in. And when they got to the cants, what they used to play it in cants, and they used to throw the fur out, leave a land fur down the middle. And they used to let it stop to get dry, and then you send the team of horses out and cultivate it and harry it down and get it ready for sowing.
There we go. We have Frank's little talk there about the headland. So on to Sutton. So here I've just included a little digitisation of what it looked like in the original response books. So as you can see, on the 9th of July 1959, Michael Barry wrote, "Sutton is a small village in an isolated position about 5 miles southwest of Pulborough, at the foot of the Downs. It is only approached by narrow lanes and buses only run twice per week. There is no railway. The village is very old with little recent development and there are several native dialect speakers. Farming is mixed, sheep on the downs, cattle below, and most of the farms are very large. Hence the people are acquainted with all of the notions of the questionnaire." So sticking with the theme of working the land, here we have Mr. Francis talking about when he was a nipper, when he was young in Amberley. He used to work 7 till 5 and do various odd jobs around the place. What I really like about this story is you can see, he says, you would look up at the trains all going up and down the line and think to yourself, must be pretty near lunchtime. And then would come a little one with an engine on it. And his boss would say, and that's a lunchtime train. And they'd sit down and sit on the plough and have their lunch. And I think that gives a real snapshot into the really sort of the day-to-day stuff that wouldn't ordinarily be recorded in this way. And we also have on the right just here, a Ransom's plough from the museum. And I have a little audio of Mr. Francis talking about it.
The plough? Well, it was a Ransom's.
Ransom's plough with a pair of wooden handles. And perhaps old Carter, if he was in good temper, he'd let you take out the plough handles and help you along, and perhaps he wouldn't do.
And that's, as I said, Mr. Francis talking about his Ransom's plough. And we have just here, I've included some of the questions on ploughing that were in the original questionnaire. So as we've heard, the researchers were particularly interested in people that were acquainted with the notions of the questionnaire. So I've included just a few of the questions here. And it basically goes through the series of processes that a farmer or farm labourer would have gone through in a year. So what is the name of a track made by a plough? What do you call the raised parts in a ploughed field? Even down to the commands used to navigate with the horses. And on the right there, we have the Weald and Downland Museum's working animal supervisor, Andy, with 3 Percheron horses, Ollie, Cash and Leon, and they're ploughing the field. This was earlier this year. And one of the things about the museum is that they're able to work the land in a traditional way, which continues to build on our understanding of the past. And I was able to talk to Andy about some of these concepts and some of these ideas that are really quite foreign to me. And he shared with me that he has some commands that he picked up from his experience learning how to plough with horses in the New Forest. So he would say, whoa for stop, just 1 step, if he only wanted them to move forward 1 step. And he'd quite often use their names in order to direct them. And hold fast was his word for go. So I think kind of bringing that up to date is a really nice part of this project as well. But one of the things that is somewhat lost from the 1950s is the in-depth knowledge about many of these pieces of equipment. So if you think about the fact that these researchers arrived in these villages, they picked a few people and just kind of hoped that they would know the answers to these questions. And you do wonder how many we might know today. So here we go. They would use visual aids like this one. So this is a visual aid of a plough. And what they would have done is they would have pointed to different parts of it as indicated on the right and invited the informant to share their word for it. And yeah, how many of those can we maybe identify now? I'm not sure. And one of those parts you will see is a swingle tree. And you wouldn't believe, or maybe you would, how many words there were for swingle tree. So here are just a few of them. We've got taw tree, we've got horse tree, land tree, single sway, sling, bodkin. And you can see on the left another one of those maps that was produced, which indicates this regional variation in clearly quite a common practice that maybe isn't so much now. And I think they're great. Batical is a great word, I think. What is a swingle tree? You might be asking. So here we have 2 examples of whipple trees or swingle trees from the museum collection. And essentially they're used to connect a piece of machinery, in this case a plough, with a horse or group of working horses. So again, this enables us to understand the past better, understand the connection between these things in order to learn more about the past, both through the words and the heritage of these local areas. Another theme, we've talked a bit about working the land. Another theme that comes out of the questionnaire was the whole section on house and housekeeping. And as I said, they didn't speak to very many women, but the women that they did speak to, they predominantly asked them questions about the home because of the lives that these women were living. So one of the questions is, what do you call the large earthenware thing which people keep or used to keep their bread? And they got 30 or more regional variations of these, what I would call a bread bin in the responses. So we've got steen, pippin, pankin, bowl, pippin pot, crock, maiden pot, real variety there. And again, they were able to map out exactly where these words came from, depending on which informant gave them as their answer to where do you keep your bread. Again, we have drawings of these things. So here you can see a response from one of the Greater London sites. and you get dimensions, you get drawings of this bread bin, bread pan, and what the difference is and how they might be used just there. We also have here, thanks to Mrs. Stevens in Firle, that we've got a loaf, which is round only, and that's the shape of it, and then bread, which was a general term for Miss Stevens. Then we have here Miss Fluin from Farningham in Kent, has top and bottom loaves. For what on the right, we see Mrs. Hayden from Thursley in Surrey has written cottage and written down in phonetics here with a little drawing by Michael Barry. And I know she's not in West Sussex, but I couldn't help but share Mrs. Heselden with you, who was from Pateley Bridge in North Yorkshire. And she describes in quite a lot of detail how to make bread using a bowl that you've warmed by the fire. So I'll just play that for you.
Now, when you start to bake, if you're going to make a bit of white bread, you want to warm your bowl in front of the fire a bit first, and then you put a bit of flour in, as much as you think you'll want, up in a quarter of a stone here. And then you just dolly it out, get it out through the middle a bit, and make a little bit of a hole in the middle, and you put a little bit of yeast in, crumble it up with your fingers, and put a little bit of lard in. And then you put a drop of warm water, either warm water or milk and water, just as you have it to spare. And you put it down, and they say make a little bit of a well on it. And then you get a bit of salt. You sprinkle it round the side at the top now, at the edge. And then, in a while, when it's all bubbled up, in the middle, you start and stir it round with a spoon. And stir and keep putting a little drop more water until it gets nice and doughy, and then you just start, and you knead on top. You knead it from side to middle and side to middle till you've gotten it so you can clean the bowl and clean your hands with it. And then you...
So there we go. There we have Miss Heselden sharing her bread making tips with us all. And then we also have, even though, as I said, many of the informants were men, we do also have reflections from them about who was doing this work. So I'm going to play to you in just a second Frank Cox, who we met earlier, talking about his mother baking bread. But you can also see here that we've got a couple of bread pans or bread bins, whatever you may call them, pankins. And we brought them out as part of one of the museum's Historic Life weekends, which are themed weekends at the museum with additional interpretation. And the Sew to Dough weekend enabled us to really have some of these conversations, much like they were having in the 1950s. And you can see we laid out a number of different types of bread, bap, bun, crumpet, whatever you may call it. And we were able to have these conversations, and many people shared with us stories like you're about to hear from Frank Cox about what their mothers did, what their aunties did, what they've taught their children. So I think that it all comes round full circle, really. But I'll just play this from Mr. Cox.
Twice a week in the old brick ovens, where you put faggots in the oven. He used to cook, bake bread twice a week. He used to ask us from one time to another. And you could eat that bread from 1 week onto another. If it had been kept a fortnight, it would be pretty as good as far as when it was first made. And no mildew in it, no nothing then.
So we can hear there that Frank Cox is reminiscing about making bread. Just and that kind of brings me to the end, really, of my whistle-stop tour of West Sussex and the Dialect and Heritage Project. I couldn't possibly include everything, and I would really encourage you to go to the website, which we'll share in the chat in just a bit. But there are many ways that you can get involved in this fab project, which is running until next year. So if you've got a connection to one of the villages that I've mentioned, or if you go on the website and you notice that you have a connection to one of those villages, please do get in touch. You can either do an interview, or you can help us trace some of the descendants. We've been interviewing people who are related to those people that were interviewed in the 1950s. You can also share your words on the website, And thank you so much for sharing them with us today. It's really nice to hear that there's so much variation with what we all call a cheesy bug, or whatever it may be. You can also volunteer with us. So as I mentioned, we've got all histories going on throughout this sort of project in this time period. So if you'd like to become a dialect field worker, you're very welcome to. Equally, we've got people working on transcription, coming along to events, and also being an advocate and publicity volunteer within the communities. And we also have a little display. So at the West Sussex Record Office, you can find out a bit more information about the survey and take part in a paper one if you'd rather do that. But that's me really. We're going to try and collate some of the questions that you've been asking, and I'll try and answer them as best as I can.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. That was really interesting and fantastic to hear some of the examples of that West Sussex dialect, which kind of really, really different from what we might think of as being West Sussex dialect today. We've had some good questions coming in through the talk, and we've got some more being added too. So I'm going to start with one from Kate, who's curious about why they had to have good teeth for the survey.
That is a great question. And I think the old men with good teeth is something that we've really kind of enjoyed diving into as part of this project. And the good teeth was predominantly because they didn't want the diction of these informants to be impacted by bad dentures or lack of teeth. So they felt that if people had their good teeth, that they'd get accurate results for their survey. They wouldn't be skewed in any way by any teeth issues.
Great, thank you. I was quite curious about that too. Talking of surveys, I'm just going to launch our poll quickly, and then we'll continue with the questions. I think you spotted this one, Amy, but Jenny asks, was Mrs. Chennell quite an influential figure in the area? She thinks there's a guiding area named after her.
It's perfectly possible. To be honest, we're still in the process of understanding these people better. And I didn't mention it earlier, but you might have seen that we don't often have a first name. So you have an initial maybe, but even in the case of Mrs. Chennell, we don't. So I don't doubt that maybe it could have been the same person. And I'd love to, if you do know anything about that, please do let me know. I'd love to dive into it deeper, but I can't kind of give you a solid answer either way, I'm afraid.
Okay. Thank you. And then as a comment from Rebecca about whether you know of a book by Lillian Mary Hunt of Bedham entitled Honour Thy Father, their recollections of rural life over late 19th century and early 20th century, and particularly about the life of her father as an agricultural worker.
Oh, that sounds great. I'll have to check that one out. Thank you very much.
I'll send that title through to you. Jill has asked about one of the East Sussex villages, which looks like it was close to Bishopstone. And she was wondering if you know what the isolated village shown near Firle is.
Yeah, so the three East Sussex villages were Firle, Fletching and Horham. So I don't know if that answers the question in particular, but that's the three over that way.
Yeah, I wonder if it wasn't it. What was Firle? So.
Yeah, it may well have been Firle that we're talking about, yeah.
Okay, and Monica asks, are some of the words traceable? So I think this is in relation to some of the words for kind of parts of the plough and things. Do they have, for instance, Anglo-Saxon or Gaelic origins?
Yes, so many of the words that we use today have, as you say, long histories of associations with other places. One of the things about this survey is that it wasn't necessarily concerned with the etymology. It was a big enough project as it was to start with in the 1950s. So they weren't necessarily looking into it, but certainly these things had links to all over the place. And we're also able, through this amazing kind of bank of words, they produced a dictionary, and that indicates the county that these words came from. So we are able to narrow it down, which then has since been used by linguists and etymologists to understand those links a little bit better. But yeah, it's not something that project or this project has dived into too much.
And then we had a question about Mrs. Heselden from Jenny, who says, and it's a really interesting accent. Was she a native Yorkshire woman? Because I mean, it's not an accent that you'd necessarily, I wouldn't associate with North Yorkshire today. But,
Yeah, so I believe she did grow up in Yorkshire, but I'd have to check, as she's not one of my lovely informants, but she is brilliant. And one of the things we have really noticed with the picture from this survey is that the regional variation from very, very kind of local villages to each other was huge. So it may well be that her village did sound like that, and it's just kind of, it's changed over time. But no, as you say, it maybe isn't what we'd associate now with a North Yorkshire accent or dialect.
Okay, so we're just going through. Monica asked were there any noticeable differences in communities, between communities in West Sussex and East Sussex in terms of their dialect and words they were using?
Yeah, so I think it was mentioned in one of the sort of village summaries by Michael Barry, but particularly places like East Harting that are very close to the Hampshire border sound more like Hampshire than maybe the ones in the east of Sussex, which often have more links with Kent. So there is quite a big variation, especially in the 50s, between the kind of east-west sides of Sussex. I don't know how strong it is now necessarily, but something that we're hoping to find out through the research.
Just because I think, they're so, like, you assume they are going to be quite similar, but
yeah.
So interesting comment from Susan, who says that his grandfather was born in East Harting but left to join the Metropolitan Police. One of her mother's relatives had one of her mother called his female sheep Toes.
That's brilliant.
Interesting one. Yos, sorry, Yos. There's an additional comment. Yos, Y-O-E-S.
Oh, I have heard, yes, Yos, like use. I have heard that. The Toes would have been fun if it was Toes. But no, I think one of the things is the words that we use are very directly related to what we're doing every day. So I don't have a different word for ewes or sheep because I'm not interacting with them daily. But I think as we notice language evolving, we have different words for different things as our working and day-to-day lives change.
Got a question which I think you partly addressed, and actually interestingly was something we were talking about just before the talk started, which is why was the emphasis on men? And we had another similar comment from Monica kind of earlier on. It seems like such a missed opportunity to have been able to capture some of that language and dialect around domestic life as well as the kind of rural farming side of things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to note is that every survey has its limitations. They can only do so much. And I think one of the primary reasons they chose men is because the vast majority of the questions that they'd designed would have been only really answerable by men. That begs the question, I suppose, you could have changed the survey, but with what they were working with and what the interests of the group were, and also research showing a more accurate representation of the regional dialect that wouldn't be skewed by a woman unconsciously adapting her language. But it is great to hear that the few little women's voices that we do have, like Mrs. Heselden and some of the others.
V asks, is there a list of the names of the people who were interviewed? Sorry, we seem to be having some connection problems here, but sorry, we seem to be having some connection problems. Which,
I think I got the end of your question. Is there a list of the people that were
interviewed?
Is that what it is? So I listed the ones in Sussex, but if you go to the website, which I think we can maybe put in the chat, I think I sent it to you, Jenny, or you can go to dialectandheritage.org.uk, and that has more information about the informants on them, and you can also from there access the special collections. And I did spot, just to sort of jump ahead, someone asked if the dictionary of county words is available. It's a published volume, so your local library might have it, or you can access it in hard copy, but I don't believe that it is available online. I'm just grabbing up the name for you. It's called the Survey of English Dialects, Dictionary and Grammar, and it was published in 1994. So you can access that in a way you would access other books, but unfortunately it's not digitized at the moment. So, but it is available to you if you would like to see it.
It's an interesting one. Again, it's one that we touched on when we chatted before the talk, which why weren't villages in Wales used in the survey?
Yeah, that's another great question. So they did actually include a couple. They sort of went over the border a little bit. But again, surveys have limitations. They couldn't cover everything. And this was predominantly a survey of English dialects. There have been other studies of other dialects, but this one covered England, I think, is probably the most straightforward answer to that question.
But they obviously didn't then go on to do surveys of Wales.
There have been other surveys, but not in this case.
Interest coming from Trudy, who says that Horsham Museum has a tape recording of Harold Nightingale, made in 1983. Spent his life in Broadbridge Heath, very near Wall.
Great. It's amazing to, once you start looking, there's all of these things all over the place. We found actually one of the Firle informants was recorded, and it's held at the British Library, him singing folk songs. And we had no idea until we went there and someone said, oh yes, you look here and here and here. And it's amazing to see that these resources are out there, and projects like this are able to sort of link up those things that wouldn't have otherwise been linked up. And it's great to speak to people like these lovely listeners who clearly know a lot about what's going on in the region. So thank you all for that.
Yeah. I think the flow of questions seems to be slowing down. Anyone else have any final ones for Amy? No, we've got some really nice comments from people, and a particularly good one from Kath, who says that, as her Brighton grandfather would say, "Stat me, that was interesting." So,
I like that a lot. I like that. I've just spotted a question from Katie, which I'm happy to answer. We have, why now? Was it always a plan to revisit decades later? Or is this second phase a more recent idea? If so, what prompted it? Great question, Katie. Thank you very much. So let's start from the beginning. This project was the brainchild of, amongst others, Fiona Douglas, who is a professor at University of Leeds. And she was kind of alerted to the fact that this archive existed at Leeds, but it wasn't being used. It was it wasn't digitized. It was in a university library, which isn't necessarily accessed more broadly. And these reel-to-reel tapes were degrading over time, and these photos and the photo plates were degrading over time. So she wanted to, first and foremost, share this content, not just in Leeds, but with the communities from which this data was taken. But also in terms of urgency, it was really important that we were able to digitize this material to preserve it for future generations. So thanks to the money that we got from the National Lottery and the partnerships, we've been able to digitize a huge amount of this collection, and we're able to prevent it being degraded any further, and also broaden the access, so it's now on the website. And we're also looking to update this research. So I've mentioned before, you can go onto the website and share your words with us. And Fiona is going to be writing a book about this process and kind of thinking about the legacy of the Survey of English Dialects, and the fact that a survey done 70 years ago is still the foundation for many linguistic studies is really quite remarkable. And we'd like to learn what its on the ground legacy was too. It has a huge academic one, but what happened on the ground? What do people know about it? And I've been to a couple of villages where people have come up to me and said, I remember them coming. I remember the researchers coming when I was very little. And they didn't speak to any children. I saw there was a question about speaking to children, and I would have loved that. I would have loved to see something from the children. And in many ways, some of the stuff touches on it. So some of the survey questions were about toys and games. So these people were reminiscing about their own childhood, but no, there were no actual children in the 50s who were recorded. But we are doing that now. So us engagement officers are heading out into schools, we're heading out into libraries to work with not just old men with good teeth, in order to update that survey in a different way to reflect the lives that we live now, that is not necessarily the lives of the people who were surveyed in the 50s.
I think it would be, I mean, it's a really important thing to do, because I think it would be so interesting to have had children recorded and then older people recorded. You see what the difference was in that same village, you know, what's kind of, you know, is there dialect that's remained? Has it changed kind of quite dramatically?
Yeah.
And we've had a couple of requests for your email address, Amy.
Shall I share my screen again, because it's on the last slide, then you'll be able to grab it up. There we go. My email address is a.stone2, the number 2, at leeds.ac.uk. And you can also get in touch with the project through the website. So if you haven't noted it down for whatever reason, but have been able to get onto the website, which is dialectandheritage.uk, you can contact the project there, and the project team in Leeds can get through to me if that's helpful, and you can get any of your questions answered that way. But I'd be very happy to talk to any of you if you've got anything to add or any things for me to follow up or things like that. It'd be great for something to come of that. But yes, a.stone2 at leeds.ac.uk.
One final comment on YouTube, Dialect British Drama League 1920s. I don't know whether you've come across that, Amy.
Oh, no, I haven't. I'm going to spend lots of time tomorrow having a look into all of these things. Thank you very much, Linda.
Great. I think that's probably pretty much everything. So, Amy, thank you very much indeed for such an interesting evening. Absolutely fantastic to learn a bit more about the project and to hear some of that old West Sussex dialect. And thank you everyone for participating as well. I'm sorry about the problems with the chat at the beginning, but it was great to see what words people were using for everything, and also for some really interesting questions too. So yes, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And okay, I'll end the webinar now.